So I'm going to come to this question. I'm showing this picture that I showed in the classical psychophysical methods when I said, hey, sometimes we're using these just to get at people's absolute thresholds, a particular person's absolute threshold, to measure difference thresholds, to look at those things across people. But sometimes we can use those classical psychophysical methods to tell us about the mechanisms of the eye and how they work. And this is actually what told us about dark adaptation. They used the method of adjustment. I'm just adjusting a flashing test light. But I have my question too, so I have to kind of think back, which photoreceptors are helping us to see in dim light? And I'll do the pause and maybe have you think back to the discussion of retinitis pigmentosa and that they couldn't see at night. Or to think back to the wiring, right? That we have more rods, those 120 rods to one retinal ganglion cell, and it's that wiring that is giving us the sensitivity to dim light. So it's the rods. Okay. Okay, so how did we find out about the dark adaptation curve and how these mechanisms work, or what are the cones doing for us, what are the rods doing for us, basically? And they did use the classical psychophysical method of adjustment in this kind of setup of what you see on the screen. So you're a participant in this study. I'm going to say you have, quote, normal vision. So you have rods and cones in your eyes. You're going to be looking at a fixation point. And as you're looking at that fixation point, there's going to be a flashing test point off in the periphery. And you're going to take the method of adjustment. You're just going to get that flashing test light as low as you can get it to your lowest threshold to show us your sensitivity. And here, notice that it's hitting in the periphery. And so if I have normal vision, that flashing test light is going to be hitting both my rods and my cones. And what they found was, if you see where that point is pointing to, where the little dot where it says cone light adjusted sensitivity, that is as low as I can get that flashing test light when the lights are still on, right? Because the lights are on, it's harder to see. It has to be a little bit brighter. As soon as the lights go off, I can lower it, right? Now I can see it a little bit better. I'll lower it a little bit. I continue to lower it and lower it over time, slowly. And then we see this kind of plateau, right? I only got as low as I could go for a while, and I'm not changing it for a little while. And that plateau is around almost 6 minutes. And then almost 10 minutes out, I'm like, oh, I can make that go a little bit lower. And then I can make it lower and lower and lower. So again, my threshold going down, showing that I'm becoming more sensitive, right, to the light. And we get to our maximum sensitivity at about 25, 30 minutes out. And I'm hoping that sounds a little bit familiar with going back to the time it takes for regeneration. For the cones, about 6 minutes. For the rods, about 30 minutes. Okay, I'm going to come back to this page and say, well, what is the role of the cones and how do we find out about the role of the cones? Well, let's do this same study where you are looking at a fixation point, only now let's put that flashing test light right in your foveal vision, where your foveal vision only has cones, right? And we're going to have you do the same thing, the method of adjustment. And what they see in this case, I start out the same, the cone light adapted sensitivity. There's my little dot. This is as low as I can get it with the lights on. Turn out the lights. I start lowering it and lowering it. It plateaus and it stays there. It stays at that green line where I only get so sensitive. I don't get to my maximum sensitivity. It's just my cones that I'm using right now, and they only get so sensitive. Their threshold can only get so low. Okay, let's look at the role of the rods. How do we figure out what is the role that the rods are playing? Well, we can do our original study, only instead of using people with normal vision, we're going to use rod monochromats. So there are people out there who are born only with rods and no cones at all. They're very sensitive to being in the brighter lights, and it's a pretty rare genetic disorder, and they lack color vision as well. But so we can use these rod monochromats and have them do the same study that we did the first time, where they're looking at a fixation point, which they're not going to really see very well because it's in the fovea, and then they're going to have this flashing test light hitting their periphery. But because they only have rods are the only photoreceptors that are coming into play. And now what they see, so if you look at that top dot at very high, right up on the threshold, so my threshold being very high means my sensitivity is awful. I have that light up really brightly at the rod light adapted sensitivity. And then we turn the lights out, and they too they can immediately start to lower that test light and lower and lower and lower. And you can see with the purple line, what they basically do is they catch up. They catch up to people who have their rods and their cones, and they match and have the same maximal sensitivity as people who have both rods and cones, because it's really the rods that are allowing us to get to that maximal sensitivity. And so what we can see now is that at the first part, at that first little time of when we're dark adapting, our rods are regenerating in the background, but not so much that they're helping us yet. The cones are still playing the role of giving us the dark adaptation for that little bit of time. And then when the cones reach their plateau, and this is as good as I get kind of thing with the cones, the rods are continuing to regenerate, and they are giving us the red and purple part of that line there, where we get more and more sensitive. Okay. And so notice that this takes time. This does take about 25 minutes for us to completely readapt to the dark. Every time someone flashes their bright lights in our face when we're driving at night, and especially if it's lasting for so long that I really bleach out those rods, it's going to take the time for me to really be able to see at the same level as I could before I got to the car lights in my face. So I have learned that I need to come back to this topic and this fact that it is the rods that are helping us to see in dim light. What I'm coming back to here, though, is because of the wiring, right? If I have 120 rods communicating to one retinal ganglion cell, even if they're just responding a little bit to this little bit of dim light, the retinal ganglion cell can be getting enough excitation that it says, hey, I see light out there. Okay, and the next part of functional significance is to look at how the cones give us color vision. And I'm going to start by introducing this, this concept of a spectral sensitivity curve, where we look at the sensitivity of, in this case, rods and cones. So rods have their maximum sensitivity at about, I'm going to do this right, about 498 nanometers. And cones have their maximum sensitivity at about 560 nanometers. And that is an estimate from your author, and we're going to look at where that estimate comes from. So looking at how we measure spectral sensitivity, scientists have created these monochromatic lights that truly are the sinusoidal waveform, and they are monochromatic to determine our thresholds at different wavelengths. And the threshold for light is going to look like we were just looking at with the dark adaptation curve, where my lowest threshold is where I'm actually have the most sensitivity, right? So we can take this 1 over threshold and get sensitivity, or look at or get a sensitivity curve. And a lot of times they talk about it as the absorption levels of the rods or cones, where they do their maximal absorption of these photons of light. Okay, and so let's look at some of these spectral sensitivity curves, or really where we have our maximal absorption. So rods have their maximal absorption at 498 nanometers, right? But we also have, so those cones before were collapsed across these 3 different kinds of cones. We have short wavelength cones that have their maximum absorption level at about 419 nanometers. We have medium wavelength cones that have their maximal absorption at about 531 nanometers, and we have long wavelength cones where they have their maximal absorption around 558 nanometers. That 558 nanometers is what they absorb the best, but you can also see, right, that there's this not quite normal, this normal-ish looking curve where they do absorb other wavelengths, photons from other wavelengths, they just don't do it to the same degree. And so, and you don't need to know those numbers yet. We'll come back to the cones and the 3 cones when we talk about color vision. We'll talk about them much more than maybe you want to. But if we look at, let's just say, 558 nanometers of light, or let's go into 570 nanometers of light, like that nice yellow line there. What you can see, so when I'm seeing something yellow, is that what the brain does is seamlessly and quickly and without us really ever having to concentrate on anything, it just processes these relative absorption rates. And so what this means is the long wavelength cones at that yellow, long wavelength cones are firing the most, medium wavelength cones are firing a certain amount less, and short wavelength cones are not firing at all. Okay, and I know I said it was backwards, but just roll with me here. That is the relative firing rates. If we go and let's go look at 510 nanometers, where it's a nice clear green. At 510 nanometers, and remember, I'm out in the daytime vision and using these cones. Cones are our photopic vision, and the rods aren't really in play. They are they're bleached. They're just constantly just regenerating and doing their thing, but they're not really playing a role in our vision when we're out in the bright daytime. So here we are at 510 nanometers, and what this means, right, is the medium wavelength cones are firing the most, so we're just following that down, right, and then the long wavelength cones are firing, but not as much as the medium wavelength cones. The short wavelength cones are firing maybe a little teeny tiny bit. And so again, it's the relative firing rates that's going to tell us where we are on that electromagnetic spectrum. And when we look at things like color deficiency, when I'm missing one of those cones, I'm missing some of the shade variations, right? Some of the ability to distinguish certain colors in certain areas of that electromagnetic spectrum. And here I am just doing the same thing, but with the words on the slide, that things I just explained, but as simply as I can in kind of one sentence. Cones help us to see a range of colors because there are 3 of them, and they're responding to different wavelengths. And what we are processing is the relative firing rates. And finally, we'll come to the summary or review. So we have talked about the mechanics of the eye. We've talked about focusing that information, that light information on the retina, and especially the foveal retina. And we've talked about these photoreceptors, so the sensory neurons that are helping us to see the electromagnetic energy in the world. And we've talked about the differences in their physical appearance, their distribution across the eye, that those cones are in the foveal vision. They're also in the periphery, but not to the same extent. They're just really packed in that foveal vision, and rods are in the periphery, close to the fovea, but they're not actually in the foveal vision. There are no rods there. The wiring, where that wiring is giving us better acuity for the cones because they have more linear wiring, either directly linear wiring in the fovea or 6:1 in the periphery, versus the sensitivity to dim light that we get with the rods. I lose that acuity, but I do get to see small levels of light. We talked about some clinical issues, and as I was talking about those clinical issues, I think you could start to see the functional significance of what the rods versus the cones are really giving us as far as our visual experience.